Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on the 6,000 watt Western Hemisphere generator. This one comes to us from my friend Jason, who recently picked up 3 machines for $100 total. Last week we got the first machine up and running, and this week I'm hoping to make it 2 for 2. That said though, this machine, it is a little bit more rough. There is a lot of rust on the frame, thankfully no rot. Powering it is a 10 horse flathead Tecumseh engine, which does rotate and actually has pretty good compression. So the engine should absolutely run, although I can tell by looking at it, someone was trying to get it to run. The choke is on as well as the ignition. So, likely we do have some issues there that we're going to have to deal with. Also, the fuel valve pulled out from the bottom of the tank. So we're going to have to get that fixed. As far as the generator goes, it looks to be in decent shape. And if I'm not wrong, this might be a Winco generator, which would be, I think, on the low side as far as THD goes. So it will be interesting to see if we can get it up and running. It did come with a cover, but each of the little ears that hold it on are broken off. So yeah, we're going to have to fix that at some point, but I'm not going to worry about that too much for now, or this, until we know that we have a good core here. I want to make sure the engine runs and that the generator makes power. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. So first things first, let's check the oil. But even before that, let's level the machine out. The feet over here, they're kind of too short for the wheels. So with that block of wood under there, we are now sitting pretty level. And yeah, we have oil. It's pretty dark, but we are at the full mark, or at least in the safe zone. So it should be good to test with. Assuming we get this engine running, I definitely want to get that oil changed sooner than later. So I'm thinking before we go much further, let's get the tank out of the way. We're going to have to repair it most likely at some point. So there's actually 3 bolts on each side. We'll just get those removed and the tank should lift right out of the way. Yeah, I don't like these washers. I don't know if they're original, but they're kind of jammed in to the corners here. And they could kind of cut their way in at some point. So I am going to replace those with smaller washers when we get this reinstalled. So I'm just going to cut this old filter off. The line, it is quite petrified. It's going to have to be replaced. But for now, I am going to use it to supply some fuel to the carb and see if we can get this thing to fire up. So what do you think? Is the carb going to accept the fuel? Or is it just going to spill out? I'm assuming that needle and seat are probably pretty dirty if fuel was left inside the carburetor. And yeah, that needle, it is not working at all. We've made a pretty big mess of things. So I'm going to clean this up, dry it out. And I guess on the good news side, the carb did accept fuel. So assuming the jets aren't clogged, this engine might run. at least long enough to validate the engine's health as well as the generator's health. So yeah, I'm going to clean this up, then we'll try to start it. All right, I'm going to leave the choke in the off position. You know, we have plenty of fuel down there. I don't think we need to add any more fuel. The light is plugged in and turned on, and I've also got a fire extinguisher close by just in case it backfires. There is a lot of fuel in that air filter, and that would definitely go up in flames without a whole lot. And one other thing to do is to check that throttle plate. Make sure it's not stuck. The resting position is wide open throttle. Huh. That's not good. All right, so I had to shut things down prematurely. The good news is the engine sounded really good and we were making power, but the stator was about to self-destruct. The actual stator started to spin, you know, between the bell housing and the end housing. And if it had spun a whole lot more, you know, likely it would have just destroyed all these wires right here. So, you know, luckily we shut it down in time. Things look to be still pretty well situated. But before starting this again, we need to find out why it spun. You know, I'm thinking someone might have loosened these bolts. So let's double check the torque and then we'll try starting this again. So what I saw was, I thought the stator rotating, but it's actually the cover. And there's really nothing to prevent that. It's just held on by these two tabs that are bent over. So I think probably the best fix for this would be to rotate it to a tight spot, which is actually right there. And I'm still going to double check the stator bolts just to make sure before trying to restart this. It is turning actually. So I set the torque wrench to 90 inch-pounds. You know, most stators are between 80 and 100. That one was fine. Let's try this one. It's turning. All right, and then we get the last one right here. That one's turning as well. Okay, so I think we have enough fuel left in the carb to try this again. Just want to run it a little longer, validate the voltage output, and then we can move on. All right, let's try to restart it. I did add a little bit more fuel. Huh. We just got a low oil shutdown. So keep your eye on that switch right there. It's also a light. So when it shuts down due to low oil, that light illuminates. So we might have a bad oil sensor. So I think before we do any troubleshooting on the low oil system, I'm going to get the oil changed. You know, although we had the proper amount and it didn't look that thin, it did smell of old fuel. And knowing what we know about the carb, there is a good chance that there's a lot of fuel in there and maybe the oil is just too thin and getting splashed away from that oil sensor. And the oil actually isn't that thin. So likely we just have a bad oil sensor. All right, so we're going to add 26 ounces of oil. And we're going to measure up what came out. It looks to be a little bit less. But I don't think it's low enough to cause a low oil condition, although I have had some Tecumsehs in the past that were very sensitive with the low oil sensor. So I'm hoping that's the issue here. Yeah, and we are at the full mark. So I'm going to measure that up. And then I'm going to try to restart it with the fresh oil. Definitely low. So we're just over 16 ounces, 500 milliliters. So we were down about a third. And that might have been enough to trip that sensor. All right, let's try this again. I did add some fuel back to the carb. I think we'll try it with the choke off. Or maybe choke on. So things are looking pretty good. You know, we have a good generator, a good engine, and also a good oil sensor. So the issue was we were low on oil. Now, a third low doesn't sound like a lot, but I know on these engines, they are very sensitive and it doesn't take much to trip them. So now that we're filled properly, you know, everything is running well, with the exception of the carb. I did have to choke it a few times. Of course, the needle and seat, they're not doing a good job either. So we do need to clean that up. Also, the engine speed was a little slow. So there is an adjustment right here where we can increase the spring tension. But until the carb is running the engine better, you know, that adjustment can't be made. So let's get the carb off. We'll get it cleaned up. And then we can move on to setting that speed. Air filter looks pretty good, although we do have a lot of fuel in here. So it's a good thing it did not backfire. I'm pretty sure these screws have thread locker on them. And yeah, they are broken free, or at least that one is. But the thread locker, I was going to say puts a lot of drag on it, but yeah, we've got other problems here. This bracket is actually broken. So we'll try to get the breather off. Looks like that line is still flexible. And the fuel line, we're just going to cut. All right, so the carb is free. We need to disconnect the governor rod. And there is no anti-surge spring on Tecumseh's. They actually don't need it because the throttle plate has a spring. And that keeps the tension needed to prevent surging. So the smell coming from this carb, it is pretty bad. Very strong smell of varnish. But the bowl nut did break free pretty easily. Or it is actually a bolt. And it doesn't look too bad. So I think it's not going to be too bad inside this carb. And that is relative, because there is a bunch of junk in there for sure. But it's not rust, it's just varnish and some debris. No water though, so that is good. Interesting. Needle's not stuck, so that does not explain why this was flooding over so bad. You know, potentially it was stuck, and maybe just hitting it with the impact freed it up. Or maybe the float is sunk. That's a common issue with these brass floats. Needle looks good. And the float is empty, meaning there's no fuel in there. So, yeah, I'm not sure what the issue was. Potentially the float was just stuck to all the goo. I'm not sure. Anyway, there is a jet right there. That is the pilot jet. It is under this cover. So this carb, I would say, has never been cleaned, or else this cover wouldn't be here. And I think that's pretty much everything I want to remove. The emulsion tube, it is removable. There are a couple O-rings as well. And I don't like removing that because it is plastic and they are color coded. This one is pink and the plastic tends to break really easy. So if I try to push that out, there is a reasonable chance it could break. So unless I have to take it out, I'm going to leave it as is. So let me run through the passages. We'll soak this in the ultrasonic. And with any luck, this carb will come back to life. So the pilot jet might have been a little bit clogged. Not much though. And the main jet, I don't suspect we're going to have an issue with since it was kind of running on choke. So that's the fuel pickup. That was clear. Main jet is also clear. There's also a little side passage right, I was going to say right there, but I'm not sure I can even see it. So that could be the problem. If that little side passage is blocked, then the pilot jet isn't going to get any fuel. I'm going to get this gasket out of the way so I don't destroy it. And I'm going to use the Dremel just to clean up this jet and find that side passage. Once we locate it, we'll make sure it's clear. And then just go through the rest of the passages. Make sure there's no blockages before soaking this. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not seeing it. But it should be there. It kind of looks like there's something here. There we go. Yeah, it was plugged. So that, for sure, is why this carb wasn't running well. So now that that's clear, assuming the rest of it's clear, which it likely is, this carb should run a lot better. So we're going to try some mean green today. That should be enough. I'm also going to put the airbox backing in there. It's a little bit dirty, so we'll get that cleaned up. Carb is, of course, a mess. And the float, I'm going to submerge it. Yeah, that's a better way to check for leaks. And we'll drop the jets in as well. And I think this one's going to need at least 10 minutes to clean up. So it took a good 20 minutes, but this carb cleaned up really well. So the mean green, I haven't used that a whole lot. Usually I use super green. So, I would say it's a little bit less concentrated, but if I had left this carb in there for 20 minutes with the simple green, it would have turned dark in color. And in this case, it seemed to have left the metal completely unharmed. So the mean green seems to do a decent job. So we're just getting in the needle and the float. The float did not take on any liquid, so it is still good, although the pin, I did clean it up, but it's not going in very well. Let's try it the other way. There we go. Float level's pretty good. I think that is close enough. So we'll get the bowl back on, as well as the main jet. Okay, let's try it out. So actually, before we get the carb bolted on, we're going to have to pull a new fuel line through. So, this one wasn't in terrible condition, but it is fairly petrified. And like that, it doesn't have a lot of give to go on a barb. So yeah, let's go on the other side. We'll cut off the fuel line, attach some new, and pull it through. So cut it off right here. And there's a good chance we're going to have to pull off the blower housing to do this. But sometimes you can kind of use the line that's in there now to pull through a fresh piece. So I'm going to connect a new piece of line just using a barbed fitting and a little bit of electrical tape. You can't use too much though, because it will just hang up when pulling it through. Yeah, and that's what I mean. Because the line is petrified, it's pretty hard to get anything to go in it. And there we go. So I'm going to reattach this backing plate. Yeah, the bracket, it is broken. We're going to need a new one of those. And that's not something I have as a spare part hanging around. So I'm going to have to order that up. But for now, we'll just get this snugged down. And I'm going to reattach the breather. And then we're going to feed the carb some fuel. I never did find really a cause or a reason why this carb was flooding over. So I'm hoping a good cleaning fixed that issue. Okay. Needle and seat. They're definitely doing better than they did last time, so it looks like it shut the flow of fuel off. So let's try to start it. All right, so this time we'll try starting it with the choke on. Assuming the engine runs well, I'm going to make an adjustment to the governor. I want to bring that engine speed up to close to 61.5 hertz. All right, well, I think the carb is actually running this engine quite well. It did start without much effort, and it was surging at first, so I did have to apply a little bit of choke. And after about 30 seconds or so, I was able to turn that choke off all the way, and the engine ran nice and smooth. So the carb, I think, is good to go. So I think I'm going to remove these Sharpie instructions. And what works well for that is goof off. This is meant really for removing sticker labels, but it does do a pretty good job of removing Sharpie without taking off the paint. And of course, I say that, and it's taking off paint. So let's try something else. We'll try WD-40. It's pretty safe, not nearly as effective. Tempted to use more of that goof off. And as far as the valve goes, besides the rust right there, the valve is also locked up. So we're going to need a new one. The other concern is that this looks chewed up a little bit, at least on the outside. And we also have a piece of plastic kind of hanging out right there. So Yeah, hopefully it makes a good seal. It does feel smooth kind of on the inside, which is what you need. So I'm going to use this kit. Hopefully I grabbed the right thing, but it's a similar valve as to what was in there. We have a new bushing, and this valve actually has a fuel filter, whereas the one that was on this machine, if it had a filter, you know, it's now long gone. So the bushing, we put that in first. And then we're going to need probably a little bit of WD-40 or soapy water to help push this in place. Well, the cover that came on this, not in great shape. We do have some broken slats, but more importantly, all the corners are broken off. So there is no way to secure this cover without kind of jerry-rigging something. So I asked my son to have a go at it, you know, design something in Fusion 360 to 3D print. So the first thing he came up with was a square. You know, he was just looking to verify that he had the right measurements and that all the bolt holes line up, which they did. So he took it to the next level, and just as a prototype, he printed a cover in white that he designed. And it is a perfect fit. And not only that, it is a perfect match to what was on there originally. You know, everything's the same. We have the fake vents on the side, real vents on the bottom, as well as, you know, the back side. So this cover, I think, is what we need. So I'm going to have him print one up, this time in black. So technically, we're more or less done. I mean, the engine is running well, and so is the generator, and the replacement cover is being printed as we speak. So the tank has been repaired. There's really nothing stopping us from reinstalling it, other than the fact that the frame is not in great shape, and it wouldn't take a whole lot to clean it up. So rather than putting this back together, you know, I'm thinking, let's get the engine and the generator off the frame. You know, we'll clean the frame up, get a fresh coat of paint on it, and then put it all back together. So to get this off the frame, we just have an engine mount on each side and one stator mount. So easy enough. And I think the big deal breaker potentially is the control panel. You know, the wiring comes through this small hole. We have a quick disconnect. But even if we unplug that, we can't pull the wire out. This plug is too big. So instead, you know, I think the control panel is removable. We have 2 bolts on the top, 2 on the bottom, and a couple here on the face. So assuming those come out, we can actually just pull this control panel off, rest it on the stator, and pull it out as one unit. As far as I can tell, it came out pretty well. So we'll just give it some time to dry up, and then we'll get it back together. Well, it's been about 12 hours, and the frame, although it's not cured, it is dry to the touch. So we can get it back together. And I've already started by putting the engine mount back on. So next, I wanted to put the wheels and the feet back on. And I guess a couple observations here. You know, the wheels that were on here were absolutely tiny, and the bolt went right through the frame on the engine side. So likely this was not factory. Someone drilled that hole. And usually you actually put the wheels on the heavier side, which is the generator side. You know, either way it will work, but you just have to lift more weight to move the generator. So, you know, this wheel does not really go well with this foot. This foot is super short, and it's about an inch short. So with this combination, you know, this machine is completely unlevel. So I do have another foot, and this one is definitely longer, but it's actually kind of the opposite problem. You know, this one's about a ½ inch too long. So it'll get us a little closer, but not quite what we're looking for. So I do have another set of wheels that actually seem to be the same make as what's on there right now, but they are a little bit larger in diameter. And although still not perfect, it's pretty close. So I'm thinking we use these slightly larger wheels with this foot. So these will bolt right on. You know, the foot, we're going to have to drill a couple holes to install that. And then this should sit level. Yeah, actually, I cannot use this wheel. Although it looks good and it has ball bearings, which are pretty smooth, the rim seems to be bent pretty bad. So if I rotate it, hopefully that shows up. But it is wobbling pretty bad, back and forth. So, yeah, this one's out. I do have another set that are about the same size, you know, no ball bearing, but, you know, for a generator, you really don't need one. This one is a little bit larger, so that might work to our advantage. Let's just double check. Yeah, actually, I think the larger wheel is just going to help level it out even more. So I am going to need a longer bolt. The one that's on there right now can only engage a couple threads, and I want it to be long enough to actually engage the nylock so that, you know, the nut won't spin out. But for now, it'll get us up and going. And that is pretty much perfect. So now this machine has a fairly standard size wheel, and with that foot, we are sitting nice and level. So to secure it, we do need to drill a couple holes, and then we'll bolt it down. So we'll just put this in. I drilled the hole pretty much exactly the right size, so I have to be pretty exact on the other side where I drill. So like this, you know, that just makes sure that everything is aligned properly for that second hole. And this machine did not come with a handle. Yeah, I almost hate to use this one. And I bought it for another project, but it fits this frame perfectly. The reason why I don't want to use it is because brand new, these are about 50 bucks. So that's a pretty big investment in a machine that only cost $33. So I was really tempted to just pull the sticker off entirely. Kind of looks like a billboard, but it does have a lot of important information on there, so for better or worse, I left it. And although the billboard on the other side doesn't look great, the stator cover still has its protective plastic on it. So I think removing this will be an improvement. So it's going to be a tight fit, but I think we can get this box in kind of after the fact here. I guess worst case, we can loosen the stator mount and just move it over a bit. going to get the fuel line connected now, and we'll get some gas in the tank. Make sure that the new bushing is going to hold. So far, so good. The bushing looks nice and dry. So the tank, I think, is done. And really, this machine is getting very close to done. I did stop at the hardware store earlier today, picked up some bolts, so I've already swapped those out with ones of the proper length. But we are still waiting on two things. I ordered a new old stock bracket to hold the airbox cover on, so that'll be here in a few days. And the end cover, it's still printing. So once we have those two items, we'll get them installed, then we'll roll this outside and try it out. All right, so let's get the airbox back together. I did get a new piece to replace the broken one, and we also have a bit of thread locker on the screw. Since it's in the airbox, there is a risk, although be it a low one, that if the screw rattles out, it could get sucked into the engine. And finally, we have the last piece of the puzzle here. So the original cover, not usable, and my son designed and printed these. This one was a prototype just using PLA, and the final one using black ABS. So let's get this installed, and then I think we'll be ready to get this outside and try it out. All right, so we are more or less ready to go. Now, according to the billboard, this machine is rated at 6,000 watts. But of that, I am highly skeptical because we only have a 10-horse engine, and these engines usually max out at about 5,500 watts. So I guess we'll find out in a minute when we put it to the test. So the plan is to get the engine started, and while it's warming up, we'll double check the output using the kilowatt to measure the voltage and the frequency. And we're also going to use the amp probe to measure the total harmonic distortion. Now, anything above 5% can cause damage to electronics. And this one, I am certain, will be above that. But just how much, we will see. And we've also got the oscilloscope so that we can see what the output looks like. So we're going to get things started soon. But there is one problem. There is a squirrel in the branch up above, and he is feasting right now and sending a bunch of shrapnel pretty much everywhere you look. So a couple pieces have already fallen in the load bank, so we are going to be roasting nuts at some point, but hopefully he finds a better branch to move to before we start this test. So I was getting a little tired of waiting and thought I'd outsmart the squirrel by setting up my Easy Up canopy. Unfortunately, I lent it to a friend, and some of the cross members are bent, and a couple are actually just broken. So unfortunately, this thing needs to be repaired. It's not going to work like that. So instead, I got a base for a flag holder, and am using it to hold an umbrella above the load bank. So let's get the engine started and put this to the test. We're not off to a good start. The engine was surging pretty bad, so I had to apply about half choke to get things to smooth out, and then the engine stalled anyway, like it ran out of gas. So, potentially we have a flow problem with that new valve. And actually, I don't think it was completely open. So let's get it restarted, see if it runs any better. So yeah, it looks like the carb is starving for fuel. So ideally, we'd pull the line from the carb and test that, but there's really no way to do that unless we uninstall the carburetor. So instead, let's pull it up by the fuel valve and see if we have good flow. I think instead I'm just going to cut the line. That clamps on there really tight, and if I pull it too hard, I might pull that bushing out of the tank. So, we can just add a fuel filter in line to reconnect this. But for now, let's get that line apart and test the flow. No, the flow is actually really good. So the valve that we installed, it's not the problem. All right, so let's drop the bowl, see if we can see any issues in there. No, it is spotless. So I'm going to turn the fuel valve on. I just want to see what kind of flow we have through the needle. And that fuel flow looks pretty good. So I don't think that's the problem. So there is no sign of a problem here. We have good fuel flow. The bowl is clean. No contamination. So I'm just going to run through these jets real quick and put them back in. We'll give it one last try. But something changed. I mean, this carb was running the engine well. And now it's not. So I guess it's a good thing to test what you fix a few days later, because you never know what issues you're going to find. Okay, I'm going to get this back together. We'll give it one last try. Yeah, no change. The carb is not running the engine well, so I think there's really not much more to do except pull the carb off and either replace it with another or potentially clean this one up again. So let me pause it. I'm going to look around, see if I have any alternatives to the one that's on here right now. So actually, change of plan. I might be condemning this carb too soon. You know, Tecumsehs that have this very long intake run very poorly while the engine's cold. This has to heat up fully before you can turn the choke off all the way. And that's what we saw earlier with testing. So I'm going to give this one the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to restart it like this, try to keep it going for a minute or so, and then see if we can turn that choke fully off. So yeah, I think we're okay. You know, I was a little bit too quick to condemn this carb. And it's not the first time these engines have sent me on a wild goose chase. I have a couple videos with the same name, Tecumseh Trouble. And this was the issue ultimately, is that I wasn't giving it enough time for that intake to warm up. You know, in this case, after about 30 seconds, I could almost turn the choke off. And then after a minute, I could. And that's only going to get better the warmer the engine is. So we'll get the air filter back on, get the engine restarted, and proceed with the test. Yeah, I'm not sure what to think about this one. So the engine's been running for a minute and it's not running well. The choke is on 2 clicks, and if I turn it off, it starts to surge. So I don't think it's going to get any better, but let's put on a light load. We'll try to get some heat of that engine and see if things improve any. So without a load, we're at 6.4% THD, and the sine wave looks pretty good. So let's try 2,000 watts. And yeah, it's not happy. That's a pretty bad surge. So I'm going to call it on this carburetor. I don't think it's any good. So let's swap it out. So although I have a lot of extra Tecumseh carburetors, none of these are a suitable replacement for the one that's on that machine right now. So unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to roll the dice and get either a new carb or potentially a clone carb. So the testing, it's going to have to wait for another day. All right, so it is a few days later, and I have what I hope is going to solve our problem. This is an aftermarket carb, and my hope is it's a little bit better than the really cheap aftermarket carbs. You know, this one was 50 bucks. The OEM carb is available for $80. And given this machine isn't worth a ton of money, I thought I'd kind of split the difference and go for the higher quality clone, hoping that it will run this engine right. So let's get this carb off. We'll get the Oregon carb bolted on, and hopefully that will solve our problem. So the idle set screw, it's jammed in there pretty far. So you want to be careful with stuff like this, especially on clone carbs, even quality ones. Sometimes when they assemble it, they just put things together without really thinking about the consequence. But with the screw where it was, you know, this may have potentially over-revved the engine. Anyway, like this, it shouldn't. I mean, technically, this isn't even needed since this generator doesn't idle, so I'm just going to pull it out. All right, the new carb is installed, and the fuel valve's been on now for a couple minutes, so we're off to a good start. We are not flooding over. So before we add the airbox, let's just start it real quick and make sure that the engine is running better. That sounded a lot better. I was able to turn the choke off right away. Engine ran nice and smooth, so I think we're good to go. So I'm going to get the carb, or the airbox rather, resecured. And I'll meet you outside. We'll test this again. Hopefully, no more surprises. All right, so let's give this a try. We're going to do the same tests that we planned to do last time, and we have the exact same setup. The only difference is we have a new carburetor, so hopefully this one can run the engine a little bit better than the last. So let's get the engine started and see how it does. All right, so no issues at all getting the engine started. Without a load, we're starting at 6.2%, so that's pretty good. And the sine wave also looks halfway decent. So let's put on a half load of 3,000 watts, starting with 2,000. Handled that pretty well. We're at about 59 hertz. Let's bring it up to 3,000. And yeah, no issues. The engine speed is pretty stable. We're at 7.4% THD, and the sine wave looks good. So let's give it a few minutes. Assuming everything continues to run well, we'll bring it up to the max of 6,000 watts. All right, it's been a few minutes, pulling 3,000 watts, no issues at all. So this generator claims to be a 6,000 watt machine, which I have my doubts. You know, this engine, I'm thinking around 5,000, 5,500 is probably the best we're gonna see. So let's bring the load up a little bit more to 4,000 watts. So that's 3,500, 4,000. No issues, so let's take that off. We'll swap it for a 2, which brings us back to 4,000. Let's try 5,000. Yeah, 5,500. We are losing a bit of speed. Let's try 6,000. Wow, I can't believe it's doing that. So at 6,000 watts, we're only at 8.3% THD, which is actually very good. And the sine wave is mostly unchanged. So let's give it a few minutes, see how it does. Alright, so it's doing it, but we are kind of losing speed. We're at about 56 hertz, and the voltage is also pretty low. So we're definitely at this machine's max, and if we take off some of the load, we're now at 5,000 watts. Let's see what the voltage did, as well as the engine speed. Yeah, 57 hertz, 105.4, so, you know, that is low. But then again, this does not have an automatic voltage regulator, so you're going to lose about 20 volts from no load to full load. So the engine issues, I would say, are sorted out, or I should say the carburetor issues. So we'll take the load off, let this run for a bit to cool down, and then we'll shut it down. Well, I'd say the carb definitely fixed the engine issues. It was doing quite well, but the voltage was lower than I thought it would be. This is a brushless generator. It has a capacitor, and usually they do a better job at maintaining the voltage. So potentially, you know, that capacitor is weak, and we should probably test it, because under full load, we were only at 100 volts. And when you do the math, although it said we were pulling 6,000 watts based on the labels here, that's assuming 120 volts. But at 100 volts, we were actually pulling 5,000 watts, which is what I thought the limit of this engine would be. So, I don't know if they put that number on there knowing that the voltage would drop. So it would appear that you were pulling more than you were. But yeah, potentially we have a bad capacitor as well, or at least one that's on its way out. So let's get the end cover off real quick. We'll test that capacitor and see where it's at. So don't tell my son, but I actually cracked this cover when I was putting it on. That's an issue with 3D printing, is sometimes parts warp, especially large parts like this, and it was kind of bowed out. So when I tightened the screws, it tried to take the bow out, and, well, the result was, I think I cracked one of the ears. But still better than the one we pulled off. All right, so to test this, we do need to take it out of circuit. All right, so this capacitor, it is rated at 35 microfarad, plus or minus 5%. So we should see something in the ballpark of 35. And yeah, we're at 34.5 microfarad, so the capacitor isn't the issue. All right, guys, and that is pretty much a wrap. Out of the gate, this machine didn't need a whole lot. The engine ran, the generator made power, so things were looking pretty good. Got a fresh coat of paint on it. My son made an obsolete part for the generator end, and at that point, I thought we were good to go. Of course, as we found out later, the carb that came on this machine just was not running the engine right. So we bought a new carburetor, bolted it on. That took care of the issue, and now I would say this machine is running as good as it can. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.